Hi, I'm James from Chaosium. I sat down with Mike Mason, who is the creative director of Call of Cthulhu, and we talked about haunted houses. A lot of scenarios in the Call of Cthulhu suite are set inside houses where something goes terribly wrong. And while they're a fantastic way to introduce new players, some experienced players can get the idea that they know how to tackle every haunted house. Mike talks about how you can keep your haunted houses interesting, talks about why there's such an effective narrative structure for Call of Cthulhu games, and also talks about some of the best scenarios that have or feature haunted houses. I'll jump across the interview in just a moment, but first, please remember to subscribe, and thanks for watching.
The first Call of Cthulhu scenario that most people kind of encountered was the haunting. It kind of exemplifies mystery whilst at the same time being under threat from the mystery. It's not just a haunted house where you're looking around and you may see a few weird things, but ultimately, it's okay. There's no danger. Whereas in the haunted house, in the haunting, as you go around looking at things can happen that can actually hurt your investigators and damage them and so forth. And so it's a great combination for the idea of Call of Cthulhu. It's not just an investigative game, it's a horror investigative game where bad things might happen. That's I think why, in a sense, haunted houses work very well in Call of Cthulhu. There's many other reasons as well, but notably, it's a single location. You don't, other than maybe a bit of external research, talking to the neighbors, checking the library for the history of the property, there's not a lot else you can look into other than the house and its previous tenants. And so it limits it down, the focus down. So again, it makes it very easy to manage kind of adventure, where you're just dealing with the four walls of the property and what goes on inside, really. For the majority of the game, so it's particularly friendly to novice keepers and newer groups before they get into something very expansive like a campaign like Masks, where you can go anywhere in the world. So it's a really nice starting point to kind of learn all your lessons for how to play and run Call of Cthulhu in a very easy, piecemeal, bite-sized way.
The haunting is a great scenario, and I can absolutely see how, as an introduction to Call of Cthulhu, a haunted house works really, really well. But it appears in other formats too. From Edge of Darkness in the starter set, another functionally haunted house scenario, which is also beginner focused, all the way to Mansions of Madness, which contains some rather complex scenarios. I'm thinking of the Code. That's something that can be quite difficult to run because it's dealing with some high concept stuff, but they're all still fundamentally based around this haunted house sphere. So how does it work for more experienced games?
I think it really comes down to the nature of the plot. It really comes down to what will engage players who have gone through scenarios like the haunting and dealt with the kind of traditional ghost story in a sense. What will challenge them in a way. And so you mentioned the Code is a scenario that kind of takes the premise of a haunted house, but actually is something far different. And actually, you might go in thinking, oh, this is just another ghost story, but actually very soon you realize, no, it's not. There's far more going on here. And actually the danger is even, more serious than originally thought. And so there's that kind of way you up the stakes, you make the plot more creative in a sense. You kind of go off in different angles by just starting with the simple premise of a house with something strange, but actually really expanding outwards beyond the framework of a traditional haunting. That's really, I guess, and it's the same for most kind of scenario design. It's kind of thinking about what could be quite a straightforward challenge initially, and then really extrapolating, building on and building in layers. Really, it's about layering your scenario to kind of really engage a group of more experienced players who are coming at it with various experience and various angles, and maybe quite experienced player characters, and maybe using some of their knowledge against them in terms of like leading them down a certain path and then bait and switch and actually no, it's completely different, and then the kind of realization hits them, and they suddenly realize they're in a deeper hole than they thought they were.
So that dovetails perfectly into the main point that I want to dive into, which is how to run these great scenarios in the most effective way possible. I've run a lot of haunted house scenarios for the people that I play with, and bit by bit, as you've indicated, their investigators have started to get more experience. They've started to get more experience as players. So when you have these problems, like your characters refusing to go and check the attic because they know that there's something going to be up there, or asking themselves, should I really sleep in the house? Assuming that they're still acting with relatively good faith, they're not just refusing the hook of the adventure. How do you offer as much as you can to them to make them want to make them get pulled in?
There's different ways to do this, I guess. The first would be to think about the character's relationship to the mystery. So there's the obvious one where they are just brought in by somebody employed in some fashion to investigate the mystery. That's your kind of standard baseline. But it also goes with that, the fact that they could just say, whoa, we've had enough, and walk away. So if you can find ways to kind of really connect your player characters to the story. So maybe they are a group of experienced PCs, but maybe one of them moves house, and the house that they own is the haunted house. So they've got a personal connection, and they can't just leave because they live there. Or it could be something along those lines. It might be that messages or things that happen are directly connected to them, such as it's not their house, but they get a report that people keep hearing ghostly whispers, and it's the names of the PCs, which happen to be exactly their names. Or there's someone does some automatic writing or some sort of seance, and it conjures that PC or another player character, again, their name or something about them that means it's uniquely them, and therefore they don't know why there's a connection to the house, but there is now. And so there's a natural drive. So why is the ghost calling my name? I have to go and deal with it. Maybe there's some dire warning. If Mr. Smith does not come and do this at this house or whatever, then doom upon him and his family or something. Maybe there's some dire threat connected, again, to pull them into it. So you're looking at ways to kind of make it personal. The more personal you can make a scenario, whether it's a haunted house or anything, the more likely the players can find something to latch onto and engage with.
Mechanically, even with good story, good hook, you can get into a game of Call of Cthulhu in a haunted house, and you can feel like the answer is a little obvious. You have to stop yourself from just going and checking the attic, going and checking the basement, definitely not sleeping in the place, checking the creepy shed out the back. Feels like there's often a couple of fairly obvious answers, and if you pull away from them, you can actually end up damaging the scenario just as much as if you'd gone straight towards them. So how do you manage to not make using these tropes cliche, or how do you find new exciting tropes to play with?
I think it comes to kind of that being a bit creative with it all. I mean, there are people in the real world, parapsychologists, who will go and view many, many haunted houses. And one of the things that you kind of see, there are commonalities between different sorts of haunted houses. There are kind of, poltergeist activity means things are likely to get thrown around, or objects moving, or disappearing and appearing, that kind of thing, which are common to those style of hauntings. But there are many other different hauntings as well. So try not to necessarily put everything in your one haunted house. If you're planning on doing more than one in the course of a particular sort of group of scenarios, adventuring lives, try and think about, portioning out different elements of hauntings into each a unique kind of flavor. So while one might be like a classic kind of poltergeist kind of thing, another could be much more kind of subtle, and more about the kind of the strange communications that are coming through, the whispered words, or the writing on walls, or the whatever it may be. So it feels very different, and it's got a different tone and mood to it, because often yeah, poltergeist stuff is kind of the classic stuff because you can see things moving around and you can have them ghosts throwing things at the PCs, and that's all good fun. However, it can get quite comedic as well. Whereas switching it up and changing the tone to a different style of haunting, where it's much more kind of sinister and subtle, and you know, there's one I remember running a scenario in a haunted house where, rather than poltergeist stuff happening, I just had the ghost using the telephone in the house. And so it started off with kind of random calls I didn't really realize was the ghost speaking on the phone, until it got to a point where it seemed to be one of the player characters was the one who always happens to be near the phone when it rang, or maybe I kind of engineered it that way. And so when the ghost started speaking to them directly and ringing, and when somebody else picked up the phone asking for the other PC, that PC really freaked out, because, you know, why are it, you know, why am I the, and it became, you know, and so building on that, I made the PC the conduit for the whole thing, and kind of like the ghost realized, actually, if I can manipulate this PC enough, then maybe I can possess the PC and get a body and do it. So I kind of changed the tone very dramatically in terms of what the ghost could do, because I mean, you know, we are playing a game here, and your ghost in your side can kind of do anything you want it to do, and that's the same for the actual house itself. So, you know, in a kind of a more kind of, you know, experienced play version, the house inside, the rooms inside don't need to be static. You know, what if the whole house is kind of an apparition? What if rooms rooms change in terms of their time and history? And you know, whether is that like purely a kind of an hallucinatory kind of experience, or is it actually happening? Are the PCs actually kind of time traveling and you know, even momentarily without realizing it? And do they get lost time and find time and all? So all these kind of things, what I'm trying to say is trying to be really creative with the kind of the setup, and moving beyond the standard, there's a ghost haunting this, and you need to find out the reason why and put the ghost to rest or dismiss it in some way. That's all cool. But once you've done that in a scenario, then you want to change it up and you want to kind of rethink things through. And, you know, we've not even talked about the mythos. We're just talking about what if ghosts exist in your particular game. And that's cool if they do. But if you want to add in a mythos twist to it, or kind of a reason, there's 101 reasons. And, you know, for, you know, is it a MIGO experiment? Are there MIGO sitting in the trees nearby watching because they want to observe what happens when they do this? They drop this kind of bucket, you know, pebble in the bucket and see what happens, you know, to the animals inside. Is it something to do with dimensional space? Is it because somebody once lived there who was a worshipper of Yog-Sothoth and did some sort of strange kind of dimensional or time magic, and that's kind of the residue of that seeped into the frame of the house and is doing weird stuff? As I say, it could be any of these and more, that really will take your haunted house in a very different direction and feel very different to other haunted house stories.
So with that in mind, creativity, throwing around a couple of different ideas when you get into it, let me ask you about some other tips, things that maybe people might not have considered when they're coming into their haunted house scenario. In terms of the shape of the house, you talked a little bit about how it could be dimensional space, it could be whatever. Do you have any advice about the right size? Do you try and stick to a single area, a barn? Is an apartment too small? I mean, immediately I start thinking about miscues and things like that. But you know, or what's too big? Can you do it at estate? Do you start to get less effective if you're having the players traipse around exploring an entire manor?
I think a lot of it comes down to how many players you have and the time you set aside to play the game. If you've got, you know, a 5 or 6 players, then that's quite a lot of people to ensure you are giving them enough things to do at any one point. So the more players would suggest having more room to send, and it also means you can hopefully try and get them to split up, and you can have little experiences. You know, the one who decides to go down the cellar on their own, or stay, or actually doesn't go down the cellar. No, I'm not going down there, but the rest of them do. and they stay up in the living room thinking they're all safe, and let them have the weird experience while the others are doing something else. So I think the size of the house works very well if you think about the size of your player group. But obviously the kind of same rules apply for any scenario design. Is the more you have, the bigger it is in terms of the bigger the house or the place you set the scenario, the more work you have as a keeper, because there's more things to describe, more things to understand how, most of the time you can hand wave travel and say, yeah, you've got to where you're going to go. That's not really so important necessarily. But, you need to think about these things, because if time is an important factor, as in if they must get this thing done before 12 o'clock and they have gone across town to this other place they need to go to get the arcane tome with the spell to take back, then you need to be consistent with the internal logic of your setting, that if it took them 2 hours to get across town and it's now 11 o'clock at night, well, they're never going to get back in time, are they? So there's some logic issues just to be aware of. You can hand wave a lot of them, but to be aware of. But yes, I mean, the ideal size is very hard to say. I mean, a haunted house, you want enough rooms that there's enough kind of variation to some degree. I mean, there is no reason why to say this is the haunted room, and they just spend all their time in the room or outside the room looking in, waiting for something to happen. I mean, that can happen if you have got a really cool idea and a set of kind of events that can take place that are, that build on one another and are different and can engage with the players, then it will work. Equally, if you've got a big mansion house and you've really only got one idea and it's just, every now and again some apparition walks down a corridor or two, that's going to be pretty dull. So again, the more you can kind of build into it. And again, the trick with any kind of haunting scenario is to start small and build. Start it very small, because it gives you somewhere to go. If you start with, you walk in and it's like a scene out of the film Poltergeist, and toys and things are flying around in the air and there's light and beams and weird, that's literally the first thing where do you go from there? It's kind of, that's, it's build it up. And so when more significant things happen, they are significant. That's what you're kind of looking for.
So perhaps a slightly linked idea. What about action that happens outside the house? I think of the Cracked and Crooked Manse from Mansions of Madness, where you spend a good deal of the action kind of going back and forth, or House of Memphis, where really the haunted house is kind of the latter half, if not third, of the scenario. I have personally had games where it feels bad if you can't get right into the house, but also similarly ones where if you are forced to leave the house, you can't resolve the thing once you get there, people get frustrated. And if you want to balance the pacing, that gets a bit difficult. So what's your recommendation in terms of action happening outside?
There's no easy answer to this, but I mean, it really comes down to your plot, your what is good for the story. And because, that whole kind of going to the, hearing about the house, maybe doing a bit of research, or maybe not, and just going to the house and kind of confirming something's weird here, but we don't know what, and then leaving and doing the research and finding out something, a hook, as in the research allows you to find out about there's a potentially a hidden room that you knew nothing about the first time you visit. So you go back and there's more to look at, because you found something else to now direct you and focus you in the house, rather than it's just a repeat visit, the one before. So that's a kind of an interesting way to look at it. It's to try and how can you build in more focus to the house when people leave it, because it draws them back. Because I mean, if you're researching a house and suddenly find out you didn't know there was a hidden room, or you find out allegedly there's a tunnel complex beneath the house that nobody knows about, that's a driver for the players to go, oh well, we've got to go and look at that now. There's got to be something down there. Because it's hopefully an answer to the mystery, which is what engages players. Players are looking for answers, and so you're trying to direct them and drive them and give them give them something to kind of get their teeth into. So those are good ways to kind of, if you've got that kind of in-out kind of scenario where they're sometimes in the house, sometimes they're going off somewhere else, is to try and build on the story, build that layering in there, to drive them on.
Well, one last sort of tone stylistic question. In haunted house scenarios, houses often play a very important character in themselves, sometimes literally, depending on what scenario you have, if there's somebody who's inhabited the building or something like that. How do you make the house feel involved? How do you get your descriptions right? How do you make the atmosphere feel correct?
I think with a haunted house, it's kind of what is understanding what the baseline is for a house. If it wasn't haunted, what would this house feel like? Is it a warm house? Is it already a cold kind of house? Is it, because that already gives us an idea of not only the house, but the people that live there or have lived there. If you come into a deserted house, but you can see it's got the furnishings are nice, even though they're dusty. You can see the photographs of what looked like a happy family. The hearth is set out. It gives you an immediate kind of sense of that this is a warm house. So when you then introduce kind of horror elements to kind of make it cold, they're very noticeable. Likewise, it's a cold house. The photos of people looking very serious or sad. There's lots of mourning clothes in cupboards gathering dust. Things that are very different tone to the house. That's your baseline, and then you think about, well, now if I introduce the haunting, whatever it may be, how does that affect that feeling? Because I can say to the players, because I've given them the feeling, if they think it's a warm house, and they generally got it's quite a nice, I wouldn't mind living here. This is quite a nice house. Then it allows you to kind of, twist that and make it so actually, no, I don't want to live there, because turning the nice things into horror things is a way to kind of make that reversal work. So it's set your baseline and then work out what the haunting does to change that baseline. But equally, think about the rooms, because in a real world haunting, I'm using my fingers here, often different rooms have different atmospheres, even in the same building. And again, you can play around with that. Again, if you've got a slightly larger house where you can kind of see, what is the atmosphere in the let's just say it's a Victorian building, and you're coming into it in a modern day game. One of the rooms used to be the Victorian nursery. What's the atmosphere in there compared to the atmosphere in the study, or the atmosphere down in the kitchen where the servants in a Victorian household would have their meals and gossip and all that kind of thing? Putting ghosts aside, what is the kind of stone tape theory? What is the kind of the impressions left by the people that have lived in this place, and that all adds in further kind of depth for things for you to kind of play with, in that sense.
Weird question. I want an example of your favorite haunted house scenario. I want to talk through it a little bit, but also, if you can think of one off the top of your head, I'd like to hear what your favorite scenario that's not a haunted house scenario that actually kind of is. My example for that might be Deadlight, which is ostensibly not a haunted house scenario, but there's a lot of the beats and function there that make it operate in a similar way. Do you have anything that jumps to mind?
Well, I mean, you've helped me out here, because Deadlight would be my go-to kind of haunted house without a house scenario. I mean, if you want to look at how to do a haunted house without a house, in terms of like a deconstructed haunting, then Deadlight is a fantastic scenario to do that, because you've got this strange entity that kind of is kind of ghost-like, in terms of on a surface level. If you're just encountering this strange light being thing, you can think it's a haunting. And it's got those kind of classic tropes of it's out in the middle of nowhere, but there are people, there are places you can go to, but it follows you around. It's a bit like It Follows, in a sense. It will follow you around if you get its attention to some degree. So I think that works very well as a kind of as I would call it, a deconstructed ghost story, because it plays off those classic tropes very well. For an actual haunted house story, I mean, obviously the haunting goes without saying. However, I think Cracked and Crooked Man's, Mark Morrison's scenario in Mansions of Madness is a great example of where it's a haunted house, but it's not a haunting. It's that kind of, I've taken a haunted house, but I've added a mythos to it, and now it's something else. And so that's a nice one as well. In terms of things I've done myself, the kind of haunted house that isn't a haunted house scenario is Miss Jews, you mentioned earlier, where it isn't a haunted house, but there is a house you go into potentially that it's kind of, well, it's not haunted, but it's weird, and some of the things that happen in the haunted house that's not a haunted house are very similar to a haunted house, and it allows quite a lot of creativity for you to design your own elements within that particular building, and they can be quite ghostly, horrific, or quite alien mythosy. It's kind of, I left it kind of very wide open with some suggestions to sort of play it as you want in a way. So that's, I kind of quite like that kind of style of scenario. Obviously, I would say that because I wrote it, but it gives the keeper some freedom. It isn't too constraining. It's like, yeah, there's a building, and hopefully the PCs go into it, and there's an end, but between the going in and the end, everything in between is mutable, that you can just use what's written, or as suggested, make some stuff up, be creative. And so that's quite nice in the scenario, to kind of have that ability to kind of pour your own ideas into it without it breaking the scenario.
I like that interpretation a lot. I'll quickly break away with a funny fact that Mark told me once, that the house that he based the house in Cracked Crooked Manse on is about 2 kilometers from where I sit right now. So a little bit of fun there. I suppose the whole thing of a haunted house really goes into a submarine episode, kind of. I was going to suggest an Amaranthine Desire from Nameless Horrors as something that is sort of a haunted house as well. Is there something there from like a plotting perspective where it's just really locking the players down in an area that allows you to do so much more with them?
When you haven't got to be concerned with the players necessarily going off track, as in a you set a scenario in Boston or London, let's say, and you've got a particular 1 or 2 buildings where really the plot happens, but in theory the players can decide to go anywhere within those cities, and you've got to kind of flow with it and draw them back in appropriately or whatever. But when it's a kind of an enclosed space, I can't even say the word now, Amaranthine Desire is an enclosed space, although it is a whole town, but it is they can't go beyond it, and without giving too much of a spoiler away, there are things that happen that kind of almost reset them, and they find themselves back where they were to kind of reinterpret where they go forwards. So those are quite nice, because you haven't got to worry about people going off track, and you can therefore focus more on the contents of your whatever's inside your box with walls, which is actually what we're talking about. It could be a town, could be a house, could be an area of land. There's a scenario it's never, well, it's been published in Sweden actually, not in English. There's a scenario I wrote which is set in woodland where you are camping, and something happens in the scenario that actually creates an invisible boundary around a certain area that the players may or may never know that they are in. But if they ever get to the boundary edge, and there was one group who I played it with got to the boundary edge and realized they couldn't go any further, and they were kind of trapped in this area, and they didn't really know why. But it allowed me not to worry about, well, what if they leave and flag down a car and flag down the police, and because I've trapped them in the scenario, and they can only use the resources I've provided as the keeper. So it does allow you to kind of be very clear about what resources the players can actually get their hands on in the scenarios if you define it as a closed box in some way. Obviously, you need to ensure there's enough in it, so players don't get frustrated, and that you're not kind of penalizing them unnecessarily, which wouldn't be good. But being logical within the context of where you're setting it, then that gives players an additional challenge of, we're trapped, what do we do? As well as dealing with everything else that's going on. So it can provide a further complication.
We've gone a bit wider and abstract in terms of what a haunted house scenario can be. So for the last question, I want to really pull it back into something that I think is within the bounds of classic haunted house scenario, and something that I see happening a lot. I find that when you get into a game, very often, particularly when you get to the end, players will want to burn a house down. And it can be a great climactic moment. Everybody gathered around, whatever monsters inhabiting the walls or is in the attic is bursting out, and you've got this wonderful fire-bathed final scene. How do you make that its most exciting? How do you feed that in? Cracked and Crooked Mans, which we've talked about, has a way that the house kind of can collapse in on itself. Potentially, is that something you should build into the scenario? Should you always give the players a chance to destroy the haunted house?
I don't know if the answer is to say always, but I mean, it's possibly always a potential, knowing most players as I do, that burning down the house is an option. And to be honest, I have no problem with that. I mean, if it's a one shot, it may be the most suitable way to deal with it in terms of getting to a satisfactory conclusion for the players, that they feel like burn it down and they feel that they're kind of dealt with it. I think trying to not just say, oh, the house burnt down and it's over, to try and make a scene out of it, make it interesting. Maybe what I tend to do is try and describe not the house burning down is a secondary effect. What actually is important is what is happening to the horror. Yeah. And 9 out of 10 times burning down a house doesn't actually necessarily destroy the horror. I'm being very liberal in terms of interpreting the horror. It could be a ghost, it could be a mythos thing, whatever it may be. It may not necessarily destroy it. It may destroy its capacity or level of power for it to manifest, but it won't necessarily stop it. And if it's a mythos entity, then it may, thinking out loud, it could just release it. Now, it was trapped in a house, now it's free to go where it likes. And to kind of make those kind of consequences apparent to the players, particularly in a one shot, so there's a scenario I run where it is highly likely that the players will burn down the house at the end. It is kind of designed that way if they want to do it. But and so I do think about what the end scene in terms of my description would be, to try and ensure that it kind of finishes on an appropriate note. So in this case, I make the point that, again, I'm trying not to spoiler it in case anyone ever plays it, but I described the house burning down. I described it's normally at night, so it's dark and the moon, the clouds, and flames rising high into the dark sky. And what I sometimes do is then maybe ask them to make a spot hidden roll. I want them to make it, so sometimes I won't ask them to make the roll in case they're likely to fail it. But normally I'll say, I'd say something like, are you watching the flames? As you stand there, how do you feel? And you get that players will kind of describe their kind of a sense of achievement or satisfaction, or just we managed to get out, and you allow the player to kind of have that kind of what they think is that kind of final little monologue. And then as they kind of come to a close, you then say, as you speak those words, your eyes are, you're watching this particular bit of woodwork, the flames kind of firing upwards, catching a new bit of wood or whatever, and in that flame you see something move, and you pause and let them all kind of let that drop, and because they don't, it could be anything. Did they leave somebody in the house? Is it? And then I will describe something moving around in the flames in a certain manner, and kind of it comes to a conclusion that leaves leaves the door open, and it leaves the investigators in no doubt that yes, they destroyed the house, but they did not solve the case in that sense. And we kind of draw a veil over it at that point, leaving the players with the kind of idea that we kind of won, but we didn't, which is quite a nice kind of ending for a Call of Cthulhu game. So that's one way that, I think about how they did. Now, if they didn't burn down the house, it could be a very different kind of, closing kind of passage to it. But yeah, so my answer in a very long-winded way was, think about what the players, in any scenario, think about what the players are likely to do. And it might be a range of things from, running away to setting it on fire or driving a truckload of dynamite into it. One, will they be able to do it? Logically and realistically, can they do this thing? And if they can, then think about, well, how will that affect the horror of the plot? How will that affect the thing that's making it happen? And what are the consequences? The simple one being, they deal with it and they get some rewards and they're all happy, and then they can go off to their next mystery, or they don't solve it in the way that's really they need to, and the thing comes and follows them home and starts bothering them in their homes. Then you've got your next part ready to go.